What if one desperate phone call, from a child you never knew existed, had the power to shatter your empire, break your pride, and rebuild your heart? He was a ruthless millionaire who lost everything that mattered, until two little voices whispered the word he never thought he'd hear again: Daddy. But before we dive into today's emotional story, please tell me, where are you watching me from, and what time is it there right now? The trailer groaned like an old wounded beast beneath the fierce Mississippi wind, every sheet of rusted metal clanging as if the storm itself wanted to tear the home apart. The rain had not stopped for hours, and each drop forced its way through the roof, dripping steadily into buckets that were already overflowing. The floor was damp, the air sour with mildew, and the smell of sickness lingered in every corner. Inside the dim, flickering glow of a dying candle, 7-year-old Lily sat cross-legged on the thin carpet, clutching her twin sister Violet's trembling hand. The storm outside frightened them, but the silence inside frightened them even more. On the sagging couch lay their mother, Maeve O'Connell, unmoving. 2 days ago she had collapsed in the kitchen, her words slurring, her body trembling before going frighteningly still. At first, Lily thought it was just exhaustion, something food and rest could fix, but as the hours passed, Maeve didn't wake. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, her lips dry and cracked. "Vi," Lily whispered, brushing her sister's damp hair back, her own voice shaking. "Mommy won't wake up." Violet's eyes were wide with fear, reflecting the candlelight like two dark pools. Her stomach growled loudly, a reminder of how long it had been since either of them had eaten anything more than a crust of stale bread. "Lily," she said, her voice breaking, "I'm hungry." The words tore through Lily's heart. She wanted to protect Violet, to be strong like Mommy had always been, but the weight of responsibility pressed on her small shoulders. She blinked back tears and tightened her grip on her sister's hand. "We'll be okay," Lily whispered, though she didn't believe it. "I'll find help." Her eyes darted to the dusty landline phone on the counter, a relic of another time. No one used it anymore. The neighbors were miles away and they didn't have a family close by. Still, the phone seemed like the only lifeline left. Slowly, with trembling legs, Lily stood. The candlelight stretched her shadow across the peeling wallpaper as she crossed the room. Every creak of the floorboard made Violet flinch. The phone sat waiting, its cord twisted, the numbers faded. Lily reached for it with a shaking hand. The receiver felt heavier than she imagined, cold against her ear. She hesitated. What if nobody answered? What if someone mean picked up? What if they laughed at her? But Violet's whimper from behind pushed her forward. With desperate courage, Lily pressed random numbers, her tiny finger jabbing the buttons without thought. Each beep echoed like a prayer, like knocking on a door she couldn't see. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Her heart raced faster with each hollow tone. Violet whispered from the couch, "Is somebody there?" Then suddenly, the ringing stopped. A deep, steady voice filled the silence, confident, powerful, different from anyone Lily had ever heard. "Silas Thorne." "Who is this?" For a moment, Lily couldn't breathe. She had expected nothing, maybe static or a stranger too busy to listen. But the man's voice was real, solid, alive, like an anchor in the storm. Her lip quivered. She pressed the receiver harder against her ear. "Mister?" she began, her voice barely more than a whimper. "We're hungry. Mommy's sick. Please, don't hang up." Silas Thorne sat in his glass-walled penthouse, the skyline of New Orleans glittering below him like a sea of fireflies, contracts scattered across his mahogany desk. His phone pressed casually against his ear as he anticipated another call about acquisitions, mergers, or negotiations, but what greeted him was not the polished tone of a lawyer or the clipped efficiency of an assistant. It was a child's trembling voice, soft, cracked, and desperate, whispery. Words no child should ever have to say. "Mister, we're hungry. Mommy's sick. Please don't hang up." For a moment the world around Silas stopped, the hum of the city fading, the rain tapping against his tall windows sounding like distant drums, and his hand tightened around the receiver as if anchoring himself to reality. He, Silas Thorne, a man known for being immovable in boardrooms, ruthless in negotiations, and untouchable in courtrooms, felt a crack tear through the armor he had spent decades building, for nothing in his life of wealth and power had prepared him for the sound of a child begging for help in the middle of the night. His voice, normally sharp and commanding, softened instinctively as he leaned forward, his heart caught between disbelief and something he hadn't felt in years, raw compassion. "Where are you, sweetheart?" he asked, the word sweetheart foreign on his tongue yet instinctive, the way his mother once soothed him in a farmhouse kitchen long ago. The little girl's reply came haltingly, piecing together details of a trailer with broken walls, of rain leaking through holes, of a mother who would not wake, and as she spoke, Silas felt his chest tighten, the vague description solidifying into something achingly familiar, a property he had once purchased during his early days of expansion, a trailer park he had left behind as another forgotten investment. But her words weren't just coordinates, they were echoes from a past he had buried, for even before she finished, Silas realized he knew the place, knew the town, knew the history, and though the man on the phone had not yet told her, he knew one undeniable truth: he still owned that property. The coincidence struck him like lightning, his breath caught, and in that second he was no longer the calculating developer surveying skyscrapers, but a man staring into a mirror held by fate, confronted by the fragile voice of a child who unknowingly tethered him to a past he thought he had erased, a past that whispered the name Maeve O'Connell and reminded him of promises broken, love abandoned, and roads not taken. Yet the girl on the phone did not know any of this. She only knew hunger, fear, and silence where her mother's voice should have been, and Silas, despite his wealth and walls, could not unhear her plea, could not treat her words as a mistake, could not allow this call to be like any other business interruption, because in her voice he heard not only desperation, but destiny. The rain hammered against the windshield like 1,000 accusing fists, each drop blurring the headlights until the Mississippi backroads became ribbons of ghostly silver twisting through the darkness, and Silas Thorne's hands clamped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened, the leather groaning beneath his grip as though it too shared the weight pressing against him. The wipers screeched back and forth, barely keeping up with the storm, yet nothing could wipe away the thoughts clawing at his mind, thoughts that began with the fragile voice of a child and ended with a name he had not dared whisper in years. Maeve. He bit down on the memory as though it were poison, but it came anyway, vivid and cruel, the image of a young woman with untamed auburn hair, eyes the color of storm clouds, laughter like summer rain, the only woman who had ever disarmed the fortress of his heart. Maeve O'Connell, the girl who loved wildflowers and books of poetry, who believed kindness could heal wounds money never could, who once pressed her palm to his chest and told him there was something softer beneath all his ambition, something he should never let die. But she had vanished, slipping away like a shadow before dawn, leaving only silence in her wake. No note, no goodbye, nothing but the hollow echo of her absence, and in that emptiness Silas had buried his softness, hardened into steel, climbed into glass towers and boardrooms where love had no place, convincing himself she had been a mistake, a weakness, a chapter closed. Yet now, driving through this storm toward a broken trailer he should have forgotten, two small voices clung to him like chains, voices that trembled with hunger and fear, voices that stirred something ancient in his chest, voices that carried an echo he couldn't ignore. Could they be hers? Could they be his? Could fate be so merciless as to tie him back to the woman who had both given him life's sweetest joy and life's cruelest wound? He tried to silence the thought, but the resemblance had been undeniable even in words. The way the child spoke, her courage fighting through fear, her softness despite hunger. It was Maeve's spirit all over again, and as the thunder cracked above and the road curved into the town he had long abandoned, Silas felt a war inside him. One half of him the ruthless developer who conquered cities with steel and concrete, the other half the broken young man who once held Maeve's hand beneath the magnolia trees, whispering vows they were too young to keep. His chest ached with questions he wasn't ready to answer. What if the girls truly were his daughters? What if Maeve had hidden them from him all these years? What if her silence had not been betrayal but desperation? What if he had been wrong about everything? The storm roared, His pulse quickened, and for the first time in decades Silas Thorne, the man who thought he controlled every deal, every outcome, every detail, realized he was driving headlong into something beyond contracts and numbers, into a reckoning with a past that had never stopped breathing. A past named Maeve O'Connell, and waiting at the end of this road, in a trailer battered by rain, might be not just the truth he had run from, but the family he never knew existed. The tires screeched as Silas pulled up beside the sagging trailer, headlights spilling across the rust-streaked walls and shattered windows, the storm still raging around him like a beast determined to keep him away, and he slammed the door against the wind, his expensive suit instantly drenched, his shoes sinking in to the mud with every hurried step. A single beam of light pierced the night as he raised his flashlight, cutting through sheets of rain and guiding him to the door hanging loosely on its hinges, the wood swollen from years of neglect, and with one hard shove he forced it open, the smell of damp, mildew, and something far worse, illness and hunger, washing over him. The sight inside made his chest seize, for there on the threadbare carpet huddled two small girls wrapped in a thin, worn blanket, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies trembling, but still holding on to each other as if their touch alone could keep them alive. The older one, Lily, lifted her chin despite the tremor in her lip, her voice quiet but steady as she asked, "Are you the man from the phone?" And in that fragile moment Silas felt his carefully built walls collapse, his throat closing as he stared into the mirror of his own childhood, for staring back at him were his own eyes, the same storm-colored blue, and the shape of his jawline traced unmistakably in their young faces, blood recognizing blood even before the mind could catch up. Violet shrank back, clutching Lily tighter, but Lily did not look away, her bravery far beyond her years, and Silas knelt slowly, setting down the flashlight so its beam illuminated the figure lying motionless nearby, Maeve. His heart lurched as his gaze fell upon her, her once vibrant face pale, her skin clammy, her breaths shallow, her auburn hair tangled and wet, yet still achingly familiar, and memories slammed into him with merciless force. The sound of her laughter under magnolia trees, the warmth of her hand on his chest, the promises whispered in the dark. Now she lay broken before him, her body fragile against the faded linoleum, and he whispered, barely able to form the words, "Oh my God, Maeve, you never told me." The weight of years crashed upon him, anger at her silence, grief for what had been lost, guilt for not finding her sooner, terror at losing her now, and his hands trembled as he reached toward her but stopped short, afraid that touching her might confirm she was slipping beyond reach. Behind him the twins shifted, their eyes darting between him and their mother, confusion etched into their young faces, questions they could not yet form shimmering in their gaze, and Silas knew in that instant that his life, once measured in contracts, profits, and skyscrapers, had been rewritten by a phone call, a storm, and the discovery of two little girls and the woman he had never stopped loving. Rainwater dripped from his hair onto the floor as he knelt fully beside Maeve, the beam of the flashlight trembling with his hand, and for the first time in years his voice broke not in command but in prayer, in pleading, in the rawness of a man who realized that destiny had finally caught up to him inside a broken trailer that held not ruin but the truth of who he was and who he was meant to be. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance painted the wet streets as Silas followed close behind in his black car, his knuckles white around the steering wheel, rain pelting the windshield, wipers slashing furiously against the storm. The siren's wail was an endless scream in the night that mirrored the chaos inside his chest, because beside him on the seat lay the tattered blanket the twins had clutched for comfort, still carrying the faint warmth of their trembling little bodies, and behind him their frightened whispers echoed. Lily asking if Mommy would wake up, Violet pressing her small face into his coat sleeve as though hiding from a world too big, too cruel. When they reached New Orleans General, Silas leapt out, scooping both girls into his arms despite the rain soaking his suit, their tiny fingers digging into him as if letting go meant the world would break apart, and he promised in a voice cracked with desperation, "I'm here, I'm not leaving you, not ever," before rushing them inside where harsh fluorescent lights blinded him after the darkness of the storm, the air thick with antiseptic and urgency, and doctors immediately took Maeve through double swinging doors, nurses shouting terms he barely understood. Aneurysm, unresponsive, critical window. all while the twins buried their faces against his chest, too young to know the weight of the words but old enough to feel fear in every syllable. Hours blurred into a slow torture as Silas sat in the family waiting area, the girls curled against him, their exhaustion winning the battle against their hunger and grief until they finally fell asleep, one on each arm, their small breaths rising and falling, trusting him without question, as if some instinct told them they belonged to him. And Silas, once a man who measured everything in profit and loss, found himself unable to move, unwilling to disturb the fragile trust he had been given, staring at Maeve's hospital door with a hollow ache in his chest. When at last he was allowed into her room, the sight nearly shattered him. Maeve lying so still, tubes and machines surrounding her, the steady beep of monitors marking the thin line between life and death, her face pale but familiar, achingly familiar. The woman who had haunted his nights and fueled his ambition, the woman he once loved so completely that losing her had turned him into stone. He sank into the chair at her bedside, careful not to wake the twins who still dozed in his lap, and for the first time in years, words spilled from him that weren't calculated, weren't polished for boardrooms or contracts, but raw, jagged, torn straight from the center of his heart. Maeve, you should have told me. You should have let me be there. Not for you, but for them. For our daughters. I don't know why you left. I don't know why you carried this alone, but please, I'm begging you, don't leave them now. Don't make me raise them without you. Do. And make them grow up never knowing their mother's voice or her laugh or the way her eyes lit up when she danced barefoot in the kitchen. His voice cracked as he pressed his forehead to the back of her limp hand, tears soaking her skin. And for a man who once believed money could buy everything, the helplessness of not being able to purchase time, not being able to bribe fate, was unbearable. He had fought hostile takeovers, courtroom battles, political storms, but here he sat with all the power stripped away, reduced to a man whispering to the woman he still loved, "I'll forgive you, Maeve, for everything, for disappearing, for keeping secrets, for leaving me broken. If only you wake up, if only you stay, if only you give me a chance to fix what was lost." The machines hummed indifferently, the rain outside tapping against the hospital windows like a cruel metronome counting down her fragile hours, and Silas drew the twins closer, one stirring faintly, murmuring "Mommy" in her sleep, the sound slicing through him until he nearly broke apart. Yet he straightened, brushed Maeve's hair gently from her forehead, and vowed in a low steady whisper meant for her alone, "Even if you can't come back, I swear they will never be alone again. They will never be hungry, never be afraid, never be abandoned. I will give them everything, my name, my love, my life. But please, Maeve, fight. Fight for them. Fight for us." Silas kept his hand on Maeve's limp fingers until the machine's steady beeps blurred into the background, then slowly rose and moved to the small cot where the twins had curled against one another, the fluorescent light casting fragile halos around their sleeping faces, and for a long, breathless minute he simply watched them, every innocent inhale a reminder of a life he had not known he was missing, until a soft voice outside the curtain cracked like a twig, and the hospital corridor filled with hushed speculation that slipped beneath the gap and into the room like a cold draft. A nurse's whisper, a question half muttered at a colleague. "That man's their father," while drifted in and landed in Violet's ears like a new, impossible idea, and when she blinked awake, dew-eyed and confused, she followed the thread of that whisper straight to Silas, who had been trying to shield them from the world with an armful of tired promises. The girls' small faces, still pale from the faintness of sleep, turned toward him with a gravity no child should carry, and Violet, braver than she felt, swallowed, and asked the question that had been burning in both of them since the night the phone rang. "Are you... our daddy?" The syllables trembled on her tongue, heavy with hope and fear, and for a beat the room held only the twin rhythm of hearts. His, suddenly loud and human, theirs, waiting to be known, and Silas felt something inside him splinter and then stitch itself back together as if all the pieces he'd lived with for decades were finally finding the seam that mended them. He didn't offer a polished explanation, no careful legalese or rehearsed speech from a man who dealt in contracts and liabilities. He simply let the raw truth land like a stone, then watched the ripples. His voice was small and rough, the boardroom cadence gone, replaced by the unvarnished honesty of a man who had been caught unprepared by fate. "Yes," he said, each letter deliberate. "I am." He sank down on the floor without thinking, the tile cool against his knees, and gathered them both to his chest in a gesture that had no title, only an urgent, aching need to protect. Lily pressed her cheek to his shirt as if testing whether the warmth she felt was real, and Violet clung to his sleeve like a lifeline, her breath hitching into a hiccup that could have been a sob or a laugh. And Silas, looking at their small, upturned faces, realized the shape of forgiveness that might have existed between Maeve and him all these years could begin here. Not with words, but with presence. He told them, in fragments, the things a child needs first, that he would keep them safe that night, that food would come, that the cold would not follow them home anymore, and that he would not trade. Promises that sounded like offers, he would act. Then, amid his vow-making and their tentative clinging, memories flared and receded, images of Maeve's laugh under a summer sky, her stubborn gaze when she disagreed, the way she once traced constellations on his palm during nights when money and status meant nothing to either of them, and guilt, a heavy, unfamiliar companion, settled over him for the years he'd allowed distance to calcify into absence. He tried to answer questions the twins didn't know how to ask. Why had he been gone? Why had she been alone? But before he could sculpt careful, kinder truths into explanations small enough for them to hold, a shadow appeared at the doorway. One of the hospital's social workers, clipboard in hand, eyes professional but warm, and behind her a security guard who suggested a different kind of urgency. The woman's practiced voice was gentle but direct as she explained procedures, little things that sounded vast and final. The hospital must complete protocol for minors with an unresponsive guardian. They needed to know who would take responsibility, whether there was a relative, and whether the children had a legal guardian in place. Silas's chest constricted at the word protocol, the veneer of his control chipping away as he realized that love, however immediate and pure, would still have to clear the bureaucratic hurdles of forms, signatures, and proof. He fumbled for answers about Maeve's history, her lack of family on file, her transient records, the fact that she had once given a different name in a cheap clinic years ago. But those details only raised more questions and less comfort, and the social worker's kind face hinted at the possibility of intervention from the state if no immediate guardian could be confirmed. Lily's eyes went wide at the mention of the state, and Violet, who had already tasted too many small tarot pours in her short life, clung harder, making a noise that tore at something in Silas's chest and set his jaw. He realized in a single bracing second that if he did not move fast, the brief sanctuary of the hospital room could dissolve into a bureaucratic limbo where paperwork would decide the twins' fate more than the vows he wanted to make. He offered to show identification, to prove his connection, and in doing so he felt both ridiculous and exposed. Ridiculous because how could a man of his means, who had spent a life erecting impenetrable walls, be asked to prove his paternity in a fluorescent room? Exposed because the very idea of producing papers to prove what blood already whispered felt like the last indignity to any truth. The social worker's questions grew more pointed. Did he have custody documents, marriage certificates, any proof that he had known Maeve, names, dates, places, details he had not carried forward in an organized file because he had believed he had no need to, so he spoke her name aloud, Maeve O'Connell, and watched the woman's pen slow, watched recognition or its absence flicker over her features, and in that waiting, in that tiny stretch of time between the mention of a name and the response, Lily and Violet's expressions changed from tentative hope to the fragile elation of children who had just been given new air to breathe. Silas felt the world narrow to the sacred narrowness of this moment, the twins, the woman in the bed, the clipboard, the ticking of the nurse's watch, and within that tight frame he made decisions that had nothing to do with balance sheets. He declared he would be the one to stay with them, that he would take temporary guardianship if the hospital required it, that he would sign any form, undergo any question, meet any requirement, and that he would not allow them to be shuffled away into an indifferent system. The social worker, trained in caution, warned that temporary custody had legal parameters, and that adult estrangement, identity checks, and next-of-kin searches would proceed quickly, but she also registered his sincerity and left him with a list of documents to provide and a promise to bring the twins' immediate needs into the hospital's care while official steps were taken. While she spoke, Silas stood and paced in a small, stuttering circle, his mind racing ahead to logistics he had never tended to. Nannies, nutritious food, a pediatrician, school enrollment, the house that would be a home rather than a showcase, and beneath every practical thought, an even larger question: how to explain to two young souls that the man now claiming them would someday try to explain the years of absence and the cost of silence. He thought of calling a lawyer, of arranging for Maeve's affairs, of confronting the past she had kept locked away, but he also felt, with an almost painful clarity, that paperwork and hired hands could never substitute for the immediate simple things: warmth, a steady hand on a fevered brow, the kind of bedtime stories Maeve once improvised in a voice that made monsters retreat, and moments of laughter that would stitch the girl's fractured trust back into something whole. The twins listened as adults spoke in circles around them, absorbing the cadence without grasping the full meaning, and Lily, whose courage had led her to pick up the phone in the first place, looked at Silas with an expression that seemed to weigh his promise against millions of other empty promises she must have known. He knelt and met her eye level, spoke plainly and without flourish, that he would be there tonight, tomorrow, and for as long as they needed him, that hunger would be met at the table, that a warm bed would replace the cold floor, that their mother would be cared for, and that he would not leave them to navigate the world alone. Around them the hospital churned with its own rhythms, shift changes, medication rounds, whispered updates, and Maeve's chest still measured life in soft beats. But in the small theater of that room, a different kind of repair began, one that had no insurance code and no ledger entry. Trust was being laid brick by tender brick. Yet even as Silas wrapped his arms tighter around the twins, the future loomed in jagged shapes. Questions of paternity tests, of how to integrate two small children into the public, glossy life he'd built, of explaining to shareholders and rivals why the CEO had suddenly become a full-time father. And those problems, though solvable in theory, carried with them an emotional freight that terrified him. What terrified him more, however, was the sudden, urgent and private fear that whatever secrets Maeve had carried might surface as obstacles, old debts, enemies, choices made in survival that could cast new shadows over the children he had just vowed to protect. He promised himself then, in a way he had never promised any boardroom, that he would uncover every truth gently and fiercely, that he would face whatever came and keep the twins' world as small and safe as possible until Maeve awoke and could tell her own story. As night edged into dawn and the steady hospital lights softened, a nurse returned with warm blankets and a small paper cup of milk, and the twins, who had been suspended between terror and hope all night, let their small bodies relax into the comfort of immediate care, their breathing evening out as sleep reclaimed them, while Silas stayed awake, eyes heavy, mind ablaze with plans and remorse, and when he finally placed his forehead against the cool window, watching the first pale light smear the city's silhouette, he felt the scale of his life tip irreversibly. Whatever he had been before no longer mattered in the face of the two soft sleeping heads in his arms, and though the path ahead was full of bureaucracy, questions, and a history that demanded answers, his resolve hardened into something quieter and fiercer than any contract he had ever signed. He would be their father, come what may. The days bled together in a strange rhythm of sleepless nights and measured beeps. Silas converting the sterile hospital room into something that resembled a fragile home, spreading coloring books across the windowsill for the twins, answering business calls in a hushed tone so their world wouldn't feel invaded by the cold edge of commerce, and pausing every few minutes to squeeze Maeve's unmoving hand, whispering her name like a prayer that refused to be abandoned, until one quiet morning when the pale gold of dawn softened the walls, and he felt the smallest resistance in her fingers, a twitch so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination. But then it came again. Definite, deliberate, alive, and his breath caught as though he'd forgotten how to inhale. He leaned forward, heart hammering, just as her lashes trembled and parted, her gaze swimming unfocused before finding him, raw recognition sparking through the haze of sedation, and in a voice cracked by silence she croaked his name. Silas? And in that single syllable, years of estrangement unraveled, years of questions and absence collapsing under the weight of a reunion that neither contracts nor choices had prepared them for. Tears flooded his eyes unchecked, carving down a face that had always been composed for boardrooms and negotiations, and he pressed her hand to his lips, whispering through a sob, "I found them, Maeve. Our girls, Lily and Violet. They called me, they reached for me in the dark, and in saving themselves they saved us too." Maeve's eyes, still heavy with exhaustion, searched the room, and when her gaze landed on the small bundle of twins curled together in the chair, their cheeks flushed from recent sleep, her cracked lips quivered into the faintest smile, a mixture of disbelief and maternal ache, and a tear slipped from the corner of her eye as she whispered, "They're so beautiful. You kept them safe?" Silas shook his head fiercely, guilt and devotion mingling. "No, Maeve, you did. You carried them, you shielded them. But now it's my turn. I won't let them know hunger again. I won't let them feel alone. I'll make up for the years I lost." She tried to speak, words breaking apart like fragile glass, but he hushed her gently, promising that nothing needed explaining now, that survival itself was enough, though in her eyes he read questions. Would he forgive her for the secrecy? Would he stand by them when the world judged? Would his empire of glass towers bend to fit children's laughter? And he answered with a quiet vow pressed into her palm. "Everything I built means nothing if it doesn't hold the three of you." Her fingers curled faintly around his, the smallest grip, but enough to anchor him, enough to tether the storm inside him, and the twins, stirred by the sound of her voice, scrambled from their blanket cocoon, their bare feet pattering across the floor until they reached her bedside, whispering in tandem, "Mommy," with voices trembling between fear and relief, and Maeve's arms, though weak, lifted instinctively, drawing them close against the wires and monitors, her face dissolving into tears as she kissed their hair, murmuring, "My babies, my brave girls," over and over, while Silas watched the fragile, miraculous picture unfold, a family shattered by silence now stitched together by the sheer will of survival. The room became sacred in its quiet intensity, nurses pausing at the doorway, the steady machines marking the tempo of a life reclaimed, and Silas, still kneeling beside the bed, finally letting hope flood in without restraint, knowing that this was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of something harder and holier. The work of rebuilding trust, of weaving love through years of absence, of standing together against whatever questions the world hurled at them. But in that moment, none of it mattered more than the simple truth that Maeve was awake, that she saw him, that their daughters were safe in her arms, and that for the first time in a lifetime of ruthless ambition, Silas Thorne had something worth more than every empire he had ever built. The weeks that followed were a tender unraveling of old wounds, and a careful stitching together of something entirely new, the sterile scent of hospitals slowly giving way to the warmth of fresh air, and the sound of small footsteps echoing in spaces once too vast and empty, and on the morning Maeve was discharged from rehab, the world seemed to pause in reverence as she stepped through the sliding doors, fragile but steady, her arms looped into Silas's on one side and Violet's on the other, while Lily clung tightly to her hand, the four of them moving as one silhouette against the golden light of dawn. For Silas, every boardroom battle, every ruthless negotiation, every skyscraper he had erected, now seemed like the hollow prelude to this single moment where the woman he thought he had lost forever leaned into him, alive and breathing, and the daughters he had only just discovered beamed with laughter that rose above the hospital grounds like bells calling him home, and the man who once defined himself by profit margins found his identity rewritten in the small weight of their trust. Maeve's voice, still hoarse from weeks of healing, trembled as she whispered words that would etch themselves into his soul. "All it took was one call, Silas, the number of a sparrow, and it brought you home." And he closed his eyes, the truth of it striking deeper than any confession, because he realized he had been chasing towers of glass when what he needed had always been the fragile, stubborn strength of flesh and love, and the call of a child had shattered the walls he had built around his heart. Together they walked toward the waiting car, but this time there was no chauffeur to create distance, no tinted windows to shield him from the world. Silas himself opened the door, lifted Maeve gently inside, buckled Violet's seatbelt with clumsy tenderness, and kissed the crown of Lily's head as she giggled at his fumbling, and with each small act he felt himself stripped further of the ruthless armor that had once made him feared, until all that was left was a man who had been given a second chance. The drive home was filled with a symphony of simple things. Maeve's soft humming to keep the girls entertained, Violet pressing her nose against the glass to count passing trees, Lily leaning against Silas's shoulder as if she had leaned there 1,000 times before, and Silas himself glancing into the rearview mirror again and again, not to monitor traffic but to drink in the sight of his daughters' faces, to assure himself they were real and not a fragile dream that might dissolve with the morning light. When they arrived at his estate, the grand gates swung open, not as a display of wealth, but as a threshold to a new life, and for the first time, Silas saw the towering house not as a fortress of solitude, but as a place that could finally echo with voices other than his own, voices of children, of family, of laughter that softened marble and wood. The twins ran ahead, their small shoes tapping on stone, filling the sill and halls with curiosity, and Silas watched them as though watching light itself spread into dark corners, Maeve's hand slipping into his, her gaze filled not with accusation, but with a weary, forgiving tenderness that told him the past, though scarred, did not have to dictate the future. He promised aloud, not just to her, but to the air itself, "This house will never be empty again," and Maeve, leaning against him, whispered, "It never was, it was waiting for us." That evening, as twilight spilled across the horizon, they gathered on the balcony, Maeve wrapped in a shawl, the girls tucked under either of her arms, Silas standing behind them with his hands resting protectively on their shoulders. And when Violet asked shyly if tomorrow they could plant flowers in the barren garden, Silas knelt and told her they would plant 1,000 if she wished, because beauty should never again be absent from their lives. Lily tugged at his sleeve and asked if he would read them a bedtime story, and the once impenetrable CEO, who had never made time for anything but contracts, found himself smiling with tears in his eyes as he agreed, knowing it would be the most important story he had ever told. That night, in a room lit softly by a lamp rather than the harsh glare of hospital lights, Silas tucked the twins into a bed draped in new quilts, Maeve sitting beside him, her hand resting lightly on his, and he read not from a book, but from his own heart, weaving a tale about sparrows who were lost in the storm and found their way home by calling into the night, their small voices strong enough to reach someone who could save them. And as the twins drifted into sleep, their faces peaceful for the first time in months, Maeve's eyes met his with a gratitude too deep for words. Outside, the wind rustled the trees like a benediction, and for the first time in decades, Silas Thorne smiled. Not the cold, triumphant smile of a millionaire sealing a deal, but the tender, unguarded smile of a father whose fortune was measured not in towers or contracts, but in the warmth of the family reborn by a single, desperate phone call that had changed everything.